The 16th of January fell on a Saturday, on the evening of which day the king held his usual weekly assembly in the formal halls of the palace. These affairs were not loved by Louis, whose tastes ran in more unostentatious directions, but they were a part of his inheritance, coming to him with the throne, his hour of getting up in the morning, and the national debt, so he made no audible murmur, and ordinarily presented a resplendent appearance and a dignified sulkiness on these occasions. It was his custom to enter the hall of battles or the gallery of mirrors, in company with his consort, between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. Since no courtier was supposed to make his entrance after the king, the great rooms were generally thronged at an early hour, and the first dance began at 9 precisely. At 6:45 on this particular Saturday, for candles burned in the gallery of mirrors, and their petty light made of that usually magnificent place a shadowy, dreary gulf of gloom. Ordinarily, at this hour, the salon was deserted. Tonight, it appeared, one individual was unhappy enough to find the place harmonious with his mood. This solitaire, who had twice paced the length of the hall, finally seated himself on a tabouret with his back to the wall, and, leaning his head against a mirror, gave himself up to some decidedly uncomfortable thoughts. It was Claude de Mailly who was young enough and unwise enough to surrender himself to his mood in such a place, at such an hour. Only late in life does the courtier learn how dangerous a thing is melancholy. Claude had not come to this yet, and for that reason, through one long hour, he remained in darkness, meditating upon a situation which he could not, or, more properly, would not, help. For Claude's eyes were well open to the precarious position into which he had got himself. They were open even to his more than possible fall. Nor was he ignorant of the direction in which salvation lay, the instant bending to Louis's wishes, repudiation of the favorite, and devotion to some other woman. But, to his honor be it said, Claude de Mailly was deeply enough in love and loyal enough by nature to scorn the very contemplation of such action. He could not see very far into the future. He dared not try to pierce the veil that hid the to come from him. He would not think of consequences. Perhaps he was not capable of imagining them, for, to him, life and Versailles were synonymous terms, and the world beyond was space. His vague and varied meditations were broken in upon by the appearance of 8 lackeys, who had come to light the room for the evening. Claude rose from his place and slipped away by a side door. He had nothing to do, nowhere in particular to go. The Audiobook would be deserted. The court was dressing. An hour before, dismal with the loneliness of the grey sky and the falling snow, he had left his rooms in Versailles. He was dressed for the evening, but had had nothing to eat since the dinner hour. An idea came to him presently, and he bent his steps in the direction of the staircase of the ambassadors. At the head of this, on the second floor, he halted, knocking at a well-known door. It was opened after a moment by a well-known lackey. Claude thrust a coin into the man's hand, and passed out of the antechamber, through a half-lighted salon, and into the Persian boudoir where sat Madame de Châteauroux and Victorine de Coigny, comfortably taking tea à l'anglaise together, and talking as only women, and women of an unholy but very entertaining court, can talk. The little marquise was dressed for the assembly. The duchess was coiffed, patched, and rouged, but en négligé. She rose nervously at Claude's entrance. "Claude! Claude! How unceremonious you are!" "And did you hear what we were saying of you, monsieur?" asked Victorine, smiling mischievously, as she gave him her hand. "Fortunately for my vanity, madam, no," he returned, bending over it. Then, at her ripple of laughter, he crossed to his cousin, took her proffered fingers, but, instead of kissing them, seized them in both his hands, clasped them close to his breast, and looked searchingly into her eyes. And, I have suffered so," he murmured. "I wonder if you care." Madame de Coigny sprang up. "At least, monsieur, give me time to retire. Your ardor is so remarkable." The Duchess laughed and gently withdrew her hand from Claude's grasp. She was in excellent spirits. Never had she passed a more uniformly successful week at court than the one just ending. If she had purchased much royal devotion, and much toadyism from hitherto lofty personages at Claude's expense, why, that was Claude's affair. His career was not in her keeping, but she could, and did, treat him very amiably in private for the sake of the fierce jealousy which she was inspiring in her royal lover. It was one of her cleverest maneuvers, one that had been tried before, this playing some quite insignificant little person against Louis of France, for the king was ardently in love for the first time, and had not yet grown old in the knowledge of woman's ways. "Come, Claude," entreated Madame, "sit here, and take at least one dish of this charming beverage. And the patties are by Mouthier himself. You must taste them, and Madame de Coigny shall entertain you, while my dress is put on." He accepted the invitation readily enough, seated himself at the little table, and began an attack on Mouthier's patties with such goodwill that Madame de Coigny held up her hands. "Seal, Monsieur le Comte. Do you protest that you are a lover, with such an appetite? 'Tis more worthy the court of miracles." Claude put down his tea. "Ah, madam, the court of miracles. Do you know that for the last days I have heard nothing on every side but conversations about the last experiment of the Marquise de Coigny? May I ask if it proved a really successful remedy for your deplorable ennui?" Madame de Coigny slightly smiled. "Indeed, monsieur, its efficacy was but too great. At the time, I was in a dream of pity and of happiness. Since my return, my wretchedness is greater than ever before. Poof! How can you bear the air of this hideous place? It stifles. It poisons. It kills." "I hear," remarked Madame de Châteauroux, from her toilet table, "that Griffith will, in a few days, formally present Monsieur l'Abbé de Bernis to Her Majesty as eligible to the post of third chaplain to the Dauphin. Now, if it were desirable, it is possible that the king might," she touched an eyebrow, "might be prevailed upon to ask him to supper with the royal family." Victorine de Coigny moved uneasily, and Claude noted, from beneath his lids, that a sudden color, which did not quite match the rouge, had started into her face. "Do not jest, Marie," she murmured, half to herself. "Oh, it is quite a possibility, my dear. If you ask it, I will give him a salon here on a Tuesday evening. Will that please you? You will be able, then, to—" Victorine sprang nervously to her feet. "Good heaven, Marie! Do you not know that M. de Bernis considers me a man? How could you dream that I would wish him to know my sex? I beg of you, do not let me meet him here, or if I should, at least you must disclose nothing. It would be too mortifying." Madame de Châteauroux paused in the manipulation of her gown to look at her friend. Never before had she beheld Victorine de Coigny in confusion, never had she seen her betray the smallest sign of emotion about anything or person. Claude also regarded her with unfeigned interest. Presently he turned slowly to his cousin. "Madam," he said, softly, "why will you not make a pilgrimage with me into the Court of Miracles?" "Dear Claude," she answered, smiling dreamily, "when I go there, I must carry with me only an image of the king." And, while Claude colored with displeasure, Victorine turned her head to hide an irrepressible smile. By this time the candles in the great gallery were all lighted, and the mirrors reflected the brilliant colors of a richly costumed and continually increasing throng that passed and repassed in endless procession before them. No woman here was untitled, few of the men had less than 5, and many had 20 generations of unsmirched aristocracy behind them. Many were there who did not own the clothes upon their backs, and many others whose debts would have impoverished a half-dozen of the wealthiest of the bourgeoisie. Yet few ever went abroad with an empty pocket, and money was generally their last source of worry. Here passed the Marquis de Sèvres, a member of the king's intimate circle, a page of the court, whose estates were mortgaged, and whose Paris hotel was almost dismantled of furniture, in an unpaid-for dress of cherry-on-white satin, with pearls worth 50,000 livres on him, arm-in-arm with M. de la Popelinière, a farmer general, worth 40 millions, but not attired with half the extravagance of his companion. In a corner, taking snuff, and commenting on the degeneracy of the grand manner since the last reign, were the old Duc de Charost, who had attached himself to the Queen and the religious party, the Duc de Duras, who lived on the influence of his wife's implacable etiquette, and M. de Pont de Vesle, a successful diplomatist in a small way, and the most disagreeably ubiquitous man at court. Opposite them the Marquis d'Intrigues, a man whose scutcheon had come into existence 200 years before, beginning with a bar sinister to the discredit of a certain King of France, and M. Marche, at whose hotel could be found the best vin d'Ai in the kingdom, and who was a favorite with Louis on that account, were discussing, with the Comtesse d'Estrades, the pompous intrigues of Madame de Gramont. Everyone waited, more or less eagerly, first, for the appearance of the favorite, secondly, for the arrival of the king. "It is 8:30, remarked de Coigny to Charost, whose group he had just joined. "I am unable to discover Madame, my wife. She must be with Madame de Châteauroux, who, by the way, is late." "The Duchess is actually more haughty than La Montespan was," returned the old Duke. "The 14th Louis showed less indulgence than his present Majesty." "Possibly. But where is the favorite of the old court with the presence, the magnificence, the carriage of the present Duchess?" cried Duras, popularly. "Quite so," murmured Pont de Vesle, rubbing his chin. "Well, yes. She has, perhaps, the manner," admitted Charost, unwillingly. "And she is here," cried de Coigny. "Ah! What a carriage! What a glance! What a toilet!" cried Duras, rapturously. "It is not difficult to perceive that she means, at all events, to wreck her cousin as she did the little D'Agenois." "It is de Mailly's own fault, then. He is mad, to betray such devotion. One would never believe that he had been brought up at court." "You are quite right, M. de Charost. Such honesty and truth as his are absurdities that we do not often discover here," observed de Coigny, shrugging his shoulders. The Duchess, handed by Claude, whose eyes were fastened on her, followed by Victorine and Henri de Mailly-Nesle, was entering the salon. The perfumed crowd, half unconsciously, drew back a little on either side to make a way for her as they did for the king. Her bearing was certainly royal. The heavy velvet of her robe, with its glittering silver fern leaves, swept about her like a coronation mantle. Her breast glittered with a mass of diamonds, and in her hair were 5 stars, fastened together like a coronet. She was turned slightly towards Claude, and noticed no one till he had finished what he was saying to her, so that all had time to note the manner of her entrance and the details of the costume. Then, as Richelieu pressed towards her, she gently dropped Claude's hand and turned aside. He stood still for a moment where she left him, till he saw her quite surrounded with men and women. Then he moved away, dreading the next hour, but buoyed up with the thought of a promise she had given before they left her apartments. There were few people about him whom he did not know, and he bowed continually from right to left as he walked aimlessly through the throng. Oddly enough, however, as it seemed to him, the salutes that were returned were coldly formal. No one addressed him beyond a chilly good evening, and Madame de Gramont passed by with her eyes fixed on some distant goal. Claude's heart was beginning to throb a little, and he could feel the color surge over his face. Presently there was a touch upon his arm. Quickly he turned his head. M. de Barrière was beside him. "Good evening, M. de Mailly. Your face is troubled. In the midst of such a scene the expression is unusual. Am I impertinent to ask if I can be of service?" Claude gave the man a quick and searching glance. "Yes," he said, after a pause, "you can tell me, if you will, your idea as to why I am in disfavor with all these And, also, if you will, answer this question: is my present position dangerous? They had drawn a little to one side of the greatest press while Claude spoke. De Barrier stopped an instant to think before he replied, but when he did so it was evidently with perfect honesty. My dear Count, you are experiencing these little and very disagreeable cuts, in my opinion, first, because of your reckless attentions in spite of His Majesty's open displeasure, secondly, because of an unpleasant mistake in the story of your game with the King on Tuesday evening. The first matter you alone can rectify, but the method is simple. In the second, I will try to assist you. As to the possible danger of your position, well, let me advise you to do what may be done while it still is possible. Your pardon. Au revoir. The chief of police, bowing courteously, turned aside and was lost in the crowd before Claude could say anything further. To tell the truth, the last words had nonplussed de Mailly not a little. Presently, however, he flung up his head, and, passing his hand over his forehead, muttered to himself, "You may be right, God knows you may be right. But no honest man gives up the woman he loves because his rival is a king. And, from my soul, I believe that in time Marie must love me in spite of all." And so the lights grew a little brighter as Claude passed on again through the gallery of mirrors. It was 8:45, and the company grew slightly bored. In 3/4 of an hour 200 people can easily dispose of 10 new scandals, redigest 20 ancient ones, and anticipate as many as the remaining minutes will permit. But undiluted gossip, spiced with epigram and heated with wit though it may be, grows nauseating after a while, if taken in too great quantities, and, through the great room, tonight, there were enough chronic dyspeptics of this class to make conversation finally begin to lag. The abstract murmur, to which Claude was moodily listening, changed in character. Suddenly, as the cries of the ushers at last rang out, it became as present wine to former tepid milk. Mesdames, Messieurs, their Majesties. Way for the King. Way for the Queen, will you have the goodness to move just here? The 4 royal ushers, with their white staffs, passed down the room, forming an alley for the passage of the King. No ribbons were used, as in the days of the 14th Louis. The courtiers were better trained now. They pressed back voluntarily on either side, leaving a very well-formed lane between the two crowds. A quick silence fell over the room and the circling throng was still. Each one had sought the company in which he or she wished to stand. For none knew just how long it would take His Majesty to reach the other end of the room, where he would open the first minuet. Claude, by a series of delicate maneuvers, had reached the side of Madame de Châteauroux, and, despite the silence, found opportunity to whisper. "You will not forget that you have promised me the first dance?" And the favorite, looking into her cousin's eyes, felt, even in her heartless heart, a little throb of pity for the utter abandon of his infatuation. "I do not forget, mon cher. But thou shouldst have kept away from me till the progress was over." Claude shrugged and smiled happily. Mesdames, Messieurs, their Majesties. 2 more ushers entered and passed rapidly down the aisle, backward. Louis and his wife, hand in hand, followed after. The King was, as usual, magnificently dressed and glittering with jewels. His face, however, was as unpropitious as possible. He wore his most bored and fretful look, and he walked straight down the room for a distance of 25 feet, heedless of his wife, without glancing at a soul. Marie Leczinska, on the contrary, carelessly attired in a costume of deep brownish-red brocade, pale of face, tired-eyed, yet wearing a curiously contented look, bowed timidly to 3 or 4 of her dames du palais and some of her abbés, who had the grace to return the salutes with a show of respect that was born of pity. The company, however, quickly felt the chilling breath of the master's ill humor. "Parbleu," muttered de Gesvres to Richelieu, as they stood together at the far end of the gallery, "Madame herself is to be ignored tonight." But the Duke was mistaken. His Majesty, in his rapid walk, had seen many more things than one might have imagined. He knew that Claude was beside the favorite, and he accurately surmised Claude's intent. Therefore, when he came abreast of the Duchess, who was not in the front row, he suddenly stopped, turned his head towards her, and remarked, in a perfectly expressionless tone, "Madame de Châteauroux, I have the pleasure of opening the dance with you tonight." He suddenly stopped and turned his head towards her. And before she had time to courtesy her thanks, he had passed on again. "Ah, de Gevres, take note," murmured Richelieu, cautiously, "'tis two forms of the same expression that Her Majesty and Claude de Mailly are at this instant wearing." "You are right, my friend. You should propose something of the sort as the next subject for the competitive philosophical essay at the Academy." "With whom do you dance?" "The Princesse de Henin." "And you?" "I am going to bore myself for appearances. The Duchesse de Boufflers." "Oh. You might amuse her, then, with some anecdotes of your past sanctity." "She knows them too well. She will merely insist on talking to me of the frightful improprieties of Madame de Coigny." "Oh, by the way, as to that, I hear that de Bernis did not even know her sex." "I have met him at Madame Doublet's, and I give him credit for rather more brain than that." "Really? In that case I must take the affair into my repertoire. M. de Mailly-Nesle will be able to weep in Claude's company." "Such tears appear to run in the family. You've been rather unkind to Claude of late, and, moreover, it was dangerous to garble the story. His disfavor with La Châteauroux certainly did not last long." "No, silly boy. Really, Richelieu, that little invention should have done him a good turn. If the Duchess had refused to speak to him for a week, he would have been saved. As it is, I am glad that my position is not his." "Well, au revoir. I go to seek my Dame d'Etiquette." "Au revoir. But oh, Richelieu, remember, when you relate the tale, that it is not only from the affections of Mailly-Nesle, but from those of de Coigny himself, that the Abbé is tearing the lady." "What? Coigny in love with his wife?" "Madly. Only it is with the most delicate unostentation in the world. He is perfectly comme il faut, and to general eyes devoted still to Madame d'Egmont." "A charming romance. Thank you, and farewell." Richelieu hurried away, and de Gevres also moved more rapidly than was his wont in search of his partner. While the hours of that long evening passed, the emotions varied with them. As La Châteauroux had her triumph with, so had her cousin his revenge upon, the king. The third dance, Menuet des Sabres, Louis performed with his wife. Under cover of imitating royalty, de Coigny sought Victorine for his companion. Henri, biting his lips, watched de Gevres lead Madame forth, and then, totally indifferent to every unengaged woman in the room, sought out his marquise, who left M. Trudaine with a little laugh, and devoted herself prettily to the husband with whom she had, as she said, merely a casual acquaintance. Meantime the king was frowning furiously on the presumption of his still dauntless rival. For Claude, in the face of a dozen competitors, under the very shadow of a warning glance from de Barrière, which unmistakably spelled lettre de cachet, had, with scarcely so much as a bas-relief, triumphantly carried his cousin off from her admirers to the head of the third 20, and proceeded to make 2 wrong steps during the dance, much to the amusement of La Châteauroux and the disgust of the king, who, though France were tottering, had never been guilty of such a misdemeanor. The grand supper, which began at midnight, was virtually ended at 1 o'clock by the departure of the king, although Madame de Châteauroux, at Richelieu's side, still stayed at table, and the court, from curiosity, remained with her. There was a murmur, whether of disappointment or surprise, when the de Mailly cousins, Henri and Claude, with merely the customary salutes, passed together from the room. 5 minutes later the Duchess, refusing escort, departed unattended, and the lingering court, heartily sick of its own dull self, bored, sleepy, with aching eyes and feet, rose from the horseshoe table, and went its way to a dubious rest. For an hour every apartment on the upper floors of the palace was ablaze with light. In the city of Versailles those streets which, during the great season, were the abodes of the lesser nobility, were still alive with coaches, chairs, and link boys, while not a window in any of the tall, narrow houses but glowed with the mild fire of candles. In one of these streets, the Avenue de Saint Cloud, within the building called by its owner the Châtelet Persain, in half the apartment of the third floor, Claude and Henri kept rooms together. Just below them, more luxurious in fashion and less in content, were the court apartments of the Marquis and Marquise de Coigny. Victorine, nearly ready for the night, with a silken negligée thrown over her elaborate white gown, sat before her dressing table, brushing with her own hands the clouds of powder from her dark hair. This hair, comparatively short, according to the dictates of fashion, was still her only claim to beauty. Thus at night, when the soft, natural curls could cluster unreservedly about her pale face and neck, the little marquise was far prettier than in the daytime. She was not beautiful even now. The mirror showed her a delicate, oval face, pallid and hollow-cheeked, 2 abnormally large eyes, that were green and weary-looking tonight, the brows above them lightly marked, and too straight to harmonize with her great orbs, a nose delicate, short, and tilted piquantly upward, a feature more worthy of a coquettish grisette than the daughter of one of the oldest families in France, and a mouth indefinite, long, pale, sometimes very full of character, that would have rendered Boucher and the miniature painters desperate. Victorine had sent away her maid as soon as she was ready to sit down quietly. It seemed to her that, sleepy as the girl appeared, she would be able to read too much from her mistress's face, to see too far into her mind. Besides this, it was a relief to be alone. During the strange month which she had just lived, Madame de Coigny had fallen suddenly in love with freedom. The suffering which she was enduring from bondage was the penalty she paid for her reckless willfulness. But had it been ennui now, as of old, under which she chafed, she might have made further effort to dispel it by means of another of those startling escapades which, since she had amused the king with one of them, the court had become reconciled to. This was not ennui, then. This, she thought vaguely, and with a kind of rebellion, was the haunting image of a single person, the unchanging recurrence before her mental eyes of a man's face, the face of François de Bernis, as she had seen it first a month since at Fontainebleau. The brush in her hand had almost ceased to pass over her hair, and Victorine was staring fixedly into the mirror, without, however, seeing herself. Presently the door to her boudoir swung gently open. She started slightly and turned about in her chair. M. de Coigny, her husband, in his long lounging robe of green and gold, stood upon the threshold. She regarded him silently. He hesitated for a moment, and then asked, deprecatingly, "Will you perhaps be so gracious as to permit my entrance?" "Certainly, Monsieur le Marquis, if it is your wish." "I thank you." He walked lingeringly into the delicate little place, and seated himself at some distance from her, upon a small chair. Then the silence fell again, lasting several seconds. Victorine waited, her husband was nervously at a loss for words. Finally, seeing that she did not know how to help him, he began, in a low, impersonal tone. "Madam, it is now 4 days since your return from your little journey to this abode, and to my nominal protection. During the month in which your place of retreat was unknown to me, I confess to having experienced extreme concern for your welfare. I believe that I have never spoken to you upon the subject of those short flights to freedom which, from time to time, you have been accustomed to take, in order to overcome, as I have understood, your always unfortunate tendency towards ennui. This one just passed, however, having been of so much longer duration than usual, I have taken the liberty of questioning your old servitor, Jerome, whom you were so wise as to take with you as attendant. He has informed me that, so far as he has been able to determine, your conduct as regards any of my sex whom you chanced to encounter in that month, was eminently reserved and dignified. Upon this, madam, I venture to congratulate you. I have come to you tonight, however, with a proposal on which I have meditated carefully for some weeks. At first it will not improbably appear to you to be too unconventional and perhaps too uninteresting to be desirable, but I beg, for my sake as well as yours, that you will consider it from every point of view. I have thought, Victorine, that perhaps one reason for your carelessness about existence at court was due to your entire indifference to any of the cavaliers there at your disposal. I should have surrendered my supposed rights to M. de Mélinesle had I ever perceived that you desired him for your comrade. I have been impelled to the belief that you do not care for him. Therefore it is, madam, that I approach you tonight with the offer of myself to you, as devoted to you in heart and feeling, to be your companion as well as the protector of your name, or, as the court understands the word, your lover. With this request I couple the assurance that my love and esteem for you are now far stronger than 2 years ago, when we were united in marriage. The Marquise listened to this punctilious and delicate offer quite passively, with courteous attention, and no little amazement. When he had finished speaking, she sat for a little while contemplating him silently. He waited with patience while her eyes traveled over his stalwart figure and pleasant face. Finally, not without nervousness, she began her reply. M. de Coigny, I am now, at the beginning of our 3rd year of marriage, 18 years of age. Of course you remember how, for the first 16 years of my life, spent in my family's estate in Berry, I was carefully educated for the position which I now hold. All necessary accomplishments and the code of etiquette were perfectly familiar to me before that age, but there were some few things, essential ones, about court life of which they did not inform me. Just after my 16th birthday I left the chateau for the first time in my life. I was conveyed by my guardian to Issy, where, 15 minutes after I had first looked upon you, I found myself your wife. You will pardon me, I am sure, monsieur, when I say that my untried emotions were so strongly affected as to be, one might say, shocked. We returned to Versailles, you remember, where I was at once presented to their majesties. In the 2 days which we had alone together I had had time to admire you, monsieur. It might have come to be more than admiration. When, however, upon my first evening in the palace, it was revealed to me, inadvertently, what your generally accepted position in regard to Madame d'Egmont was, I bitterly regretted not having been taught more truly what I should have expected at this famous court, and, at the same time, I hastened, out of duty, to stifle at once whatever feeling I had come to have for you in 48 hours. So successful was I, monsieur, that I have never since been troubled by any emotion for any living thing belonging to this city and palace of Versailles. Such, then, must be my justification for the refusal of your very thoughtful offer. I can but thank you for it. I appreciate to the full the gallantry of your intended sacrifice, but I cannot permit you to make it. Believe me, monsieur, I must refuse. The Marquis de Coigny had heard her in silence. Now, at the close of her unintentionally pitiful recital, he repressed an exclamation, and sat still, looking at her, for a long moment. How brutal I have been, Victorine, he said, finally. But I never realized. I never knew. His wife raised her hand. Oh, monsieur, I beg of you, do not reproach yourself. I would not dream, indeed I would not, of blaming you in any way. It was only that I was young to the way of the world. He looked at her again, with a lovelight struggling to show itself in his face. Victorine, can you not forget? Will you not let me try to make your life happy, now, at last? She returned his glance, and smiled, dreamily, as though her thoughts had flown far. Monsieur, it is not in your power, for I am happy, now, at last. The Marquis de Coigny rose. His face was passive. Only his mouth was drawn a little straighter than usual. His bow was in perfect form. "I have the honor to wish you good night, Victorine." The Marquise courtesied. "Good night, Jules," she said, kindly. He was at the door when he suddenly, moved by strong feeling, turned about again. She was looking at him. Their eyes met, and the glances clashed. Silently she courtesied again, and, in silence, once more, the Marquis bowed and turned away.